It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Washington, Shannon Vavra, national security reporter for The Daily Beast. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks as well to Ulrike Koltermann, France correspondent for the German language desk of the French news agency AFP.
Guten Abend.
For being with us. How are you?
Very fine, thank you.
All right. Matthew Dalton, reporter for the Wall Street Journal. How have things been this week?
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Just okay.
Just okay. All right. Robert Parsons, France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor.
Everything's fine.
Everything. Okay. All right. There you go. You can listen. Listen, and also like and subscribe to The World This Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other fine streaming services. 2 weeks of urban warfare. Can Sudan survive a third? We can show you images from a bombed-out marketplace in the Nile neighborhood of Bari in the capital, Khartoum. On paper, there's a new 72-hour truce between warring generals, but that's been rocked in the capital and elsewhere by fresh gunfire and airstrikes. The UN's evacuated foreign nationals. Foreign nationals are also fleeing from other countries by air, by sea, by land. And those that have the means to buy bus tickets, whose prices have skyrocketed, have been able to flee Khartoum, like here, further north on the road to Egypt.
The fighting was constant for nearly 3 or 4 days. It was tough. Bombing and shooting day and night everywhere. We didn't have any other option but to leave Khartoum and come here to the River Nile state.
Robert Parsons, what we have here is an argument between two generals saying this town isn't big enough for the two of us, and it's brought us to the brink of another civil war.
Yeah, that's the way it looks. I mean, if you look at it in sort of classical terms of, one side being representing the social class interests of one group or the ethnic group interests of another, it's just not like that. This is pure naked power that both these men are after. But the problem is that the longer it goes on, the greater the danger is that it will spread from a power game between these two men into something much more menacing than that. And it already is doing in parts of Western Darfur, where the ethnic conflicts that we witnessed during the 2000s are beginning to ignite again. Was it 300,000 people killed during the 2000s? Over 2 million people turned into refugees and IDPs. That could happen again already in the last 2 or 3 days. In one small town, the fighting around there in Western Darfur, over 200 people have been killed. Nobody's really putting much focus on that. The focus has been on Khartoum and the exodus of Western diplomats from Khartoum, for better or for worse. But in the west of the country, we already see the signs of something much more dangerous beginning to happen. And that, I think, will be the major concern of people at the moment, trying to dampen things down and prevent this escalating into something which could really explode and suck in other groups around the region.
We could see, Ulrike, on this map, Jamena in Western Darfur, near the border with Chad, is where there's been a lot of heavy fighting in recent days.
I actually covered Darfur in 2003, and what we see now is just a sort of re-import of the violence that happened there, because RSF, the army, the militia of one of the generals, is nothing else but the old Janjaweed who grew up to a proper army, who was already in Yemen and in Libya, and so they are not... they have no respect for anything, and it's exactly the same methods that were used already in Darfur in 2003, and now they're getting all these violence without any rules right in Khartoum, and it could just trigger another big, huge refugee crisis. What we're seeing now is just the rich people getting flown out because they are diplomats, and the Europeans and Western countries, and everyone is interested in helping them. But it's only because it's very expensive and very tiring to get out. I think those people who are still there, they also want to flee. And so this is going to be huge and massive, and will have an impact on all the other countries So I think it's really big drama.
For 4 years since the peaceful revolution that ousted longtime strongman Omar al-Bashir, the international community pushed civilians to share power with a military that never went away, an international community that didn't really see coming that this brewing battle between the junta leader Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his nominal number 2 RSF leader Hamedi would spill over. Here you see the images, Ulrika, of the U.S. Secretary of State with the UN Secretary General. What responsibility does the international community have in all this?
I mean, the US always played a big role in Sudan, and they're helping to negotiate ceasefires and peace agreement, and they helped to settle the conflict and the independence of South Sudan. But right now, the truce doesn't really work. There are so many, a new day, a new truce, so there's no hope for the time being that it will actually be settled, because none of the two generals will lose power, influence, and wealth. I mean, they're also struggling about influence, and there are gold mines, and there are always economic interests involved as well.
Many dual nationals among those foreigners being evacuated. Shannon Vavra, I know the Daily Beast this week reported on one couple from Chicago stuck in Sudan. 16,000 U.S. passports for the people inside of Sudan. Is this putting this story on the map where you are?
Yes, it definitely is. And as you mentioned, my colleagues at the Daily Beast have been able to speak with some members of a family who have family members in Sudan who tell us they feel a little bit abandoned by the U.S. government in terms of evacuations. Now, we know that, of course, many people are evacuating of many citizenships, right? And the United States government has stepped in to help evacuate diplomats, evacuating the embassy just several days ago. But the message from the United States government for other American citizens who remain in Sudan is, you need to figure this out yourself. There's resources that the U.S. government is providing, for instance, intelligence and reconnaissance and surveillance for different evacuation routes. But this is kind of a lesson learned for many people who travel abroad and many countries where coups have happened before in previous years and where they need to watch out for themselves. The State Department looks like it's going to be providing bulletins and security alerts for Americans. But if you judge that you want to go to another country, it doesn't look like when push comes to shove or when things go awry, the U.S. government is going to come and step in and save you. The whiplash, I wonder, from Afghanistan and that botched evacuation, I wonder if that's really impacting some of the messaging we're hearing from the Biden administration right now. And it's the same message we heard about Ukraine. We heard Afghanistan, this mass evacuation is an exception to the rule, and we're seeing that play out here.
And we heard a lot of references to Afghanistan in Britain this week, because there was criticism of the UK government for the way that it first evacuated its diplomatic staff. There was even a bit of tension with Germany over that matter, Robert Parsons, and then
it stepped things up and put on some extra flights from the airport. I think it was a military airport just to the north of Khartoum, and started to get hundreds out, I think, but, well short of the total number of British citizens and people working in Britain who were still in Khartoum. And the message that the British government was giving was exactly the message that American citizens have been getting now in Sudan as well. You have to make your own way out. We'll try and provide some sort of information service about the best ways to do that and the security of the routes you choose to take. But ultimately, it's your choice. But there have been some awkward moments which have been playing out in the British press, where people, for instance, doctors who've been working in British hospitals but aren't British citizens, but have work permits to be in Britain, have turned up at the airport and been turned away by the British military.
Yeah, and of course, for the Sudanese themselves, seeing the foreigners go, there is, for many, a feeling of abandonment. Everybody wants to get out of Khartoum right now, a city of 8 million, which seems to be the prize for both sides in this battle. Now, not very far away from Sudan, earlier this week, France 24's team in Tunisia filmed sub-Saharan Africans setting off from Sfax. The Italian Coast Guard warning it could face a record number of undocumented migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean this summer. There is this feeling, Matthew Dalton, that if this spirals further, it's not. You won't be able to contain it to just Sudan.
Well, Sudan already is a big source of refugees, of people coming to Europe, and of course, so are a lot of the surrounding countries, Chad and elsewhere. And of course, potentially adding to the instability is that there's concern among Western officials that actually Russia is playing a negative role in this whole crisis because Wagner, the private militia, has operations in Sudan. They own mines in Sudan, and they have been offering weapons to RSF, one of the militia there, and potentially fueling the conflict, fueling the instability there. So they don't know whether this is part of some kind of coordinated effort coming, perhaps from Moscow to really kind of destabilize the situation in Sudan and also attack some of the Western countries that are present. We saw that some of the U.S. diplomatic convoys have been attacked in the last few weeks. So that's a concern that's coming both from the U.S. and France, actually.
A Turkish evacuation plane also got hit by everybody's getting hit in the crossfire.
Yeah, and if you look at it at a wider angle, if you look at the whole region where those people are going, they're going to Chad, they're going to South Sudan, to the Horn of Africa. There's already a drought, and they're already suffering in the climate change consequences. And so it will be a huge humanitarian catastrophe. It's really only the beginning that we are seeing right now.
Times of crisis, well, you need a pair of experienced hands. At least that's the argument of the 80-year-old president of the United States of America.
Let's finish this job. I know we can. Because this is the United States of America. There's nothing, simply nothing we cannot do if we do it together.
So that's part of that video that Tuesday morning Joe Biden put out, making it official that he's running in 2024. Shannon Favre, that's not a surprise. Is the mood in the U.S. now that the week is nearly at an end that, well, this is just normal?
Obviously a lot of incumbent presidents choose to run for re-election and are often successful. But there's a lot of conversation right now about President Biden and whether it's prudent for him to run at his age. I believe there was an NBC News poll out this week that showed 70% of Americans who are of voting age don't think he should run again, and 69% of them thought that age played a factor in that thinking on their part. And I think that's something we're going to have to think about moving forward. But at least on the foreign policy front, the field is already filled with potential candidates and candidates who are jockeying for attention and already having vastly different opinions on even just when we look at the Ukraine conflict. So I think there's going to be some very interesting conversations to see play out in terms of what a future presidency might look like, whether it's a Donald Trump, a Joe Biden, a Ron DeSantis, who admittedly hasn't announced his candidacy, or a Nikki Haley. You've got, of course, Joe Biden with his record from the past several years with Ukraine, but then you also have Ron DeSantis saying we shouldn't get into, quote, a territorial dispute between Russia and Ukraine, or Nikki Haley saying we shouldn't put money into Ukraine. Although Nikki Haley, to her credit, does speak a little bit more about how we should be hoping for a Ukrainian victory to prevent sort of a broader war with Russia potentially invading Poland or the Baltics. So some very interesting jockeying to watch there.
Yeah, it kind of adds a sense of urgency to this Ukrainian counteroffensive because it's as if the deadline is that 2024 election, Ulrika Kolterman?
Sorry, say it again.
The 2024 election in the United States could help determine which way the war goes in Ukraine?
Well, I am not sure if that really is such a big issue. I think the election campaign is will be tricky in the States compared to the first time when Biden was running for presidency and he was doing the campaign from his basement and it was lockdown, and now it's going to be a totally different story. So I'm not even sure it really make it. And are there no other candidates available? I mean, is that all the talents I have? Like two old white men in this whole huge country, United States, and Trump is not that much younger. And well, there are people saying, okay, he's on a ticket with Kamala Harris, but why doesn't
someone younger
run for herself? Right.
Yeah, it's a good point that during his first election campaign, he didn't have to do as much stumping, going out on the campaign trail because of the limits posed by the pandemic. And whether, it's a real question whether he has the endurance for that kind of strenuous campaigning. America is a really big country. You got to go all over the place. The swing states are not, just all in the upper Midwest. So you have to go all over the place. And it's going to be.
If there's not a challenge to him in the primaries, I suppose that makes things a bit easier for him as well.
Yeah, that's true. And but Biden, fundamentally, he's a pretty weak candidate, and under normal circumstances, he would be looking at a defeat, I think. He's very he's pretty unpopular.
42%?
Yeah.
Macron can only dream of it.
No, it's true. Compared to,
maybe it's just
but for a normal president who's facing re-election, he's pretty unpopular. Only 15% of the country thinks...
For a normal president, noting what you're saying.
Not compared to Macron, but 15% of the country thinks that things are going in the right direction. So he's a weak candidate, but the exceptional circumstance is Trump on the other side.
Yes. Okay. So Joe Biden is of a certain age, and if you want to charm the most powerful person in the world, best to serenade him with the music of his generation. Just ask South Korea's president. Welcomed Wednesday for a White House state dinner.
A long, long time ago. I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. And I really felt my chance that I could make those people dance and they'd be happy for a while.
Robert, you're probably too young to know that song. It's called American Pie. It's by Don McLean. Your thoughts on Joe Biden again? He's in his 9th decade.
Yeah, I mean, the calculation to me seems to be that it's going to be Donald Trump he's running up against. Otherwise, I don't think he'll be putting his candidacy forward now at all. I mean, the calculation will be that up against Trump, he wins. Up against DeSantis, he probably loses. But DeSantis isn't going to be the candidate. It may turn out that they got it completely wrong, of course, and that Trump won't be the candidate. But as things stand, he must feel that he's got a pretty reasonable chance.
Both Biden and his opponent from 2020 acting like a rematch is a certainty. Donald Trump campaigning in New Hampshire on Thursday, where he took shots at Republican rivals, including the governor of Florida, and at Biden. But he's got issues of his own. He's got his latest trial going on, a civil suit by a columnist who accuses him of rape. Other dark clouds that were brewing. His former vice president, who refused to cede to pressure during the January 6th storming of the Capitol and certified Biden's election, testifying Thursday before a grand jury. Mike Pence spoke earlier in the week to television network CBS.
I think I'm limited about what I can say about the proceedings of the grand jury or the decision of the judge, but people can be confident that we'll obey the law, we'll comply with the law.
So, Shannon Vavra, if a case is brewing over what seems to many like an attempted coup, or certainly a constitutional push on January the 6th, is Donald Trump a certainty to be the candidate for the Republicans?
I think that's such a live question. We'll obviously have to see how it plays out. But I do think one thing we have to keep in mind is that, yes, Biden won in 2020, but we have to remember that there's still a lot of conspiracy theories that various Republicans are embracing about 2020. There are many voters who feel disenfranchised and who are being fed this psychological operation that their vote did not count in 2020. And I think if we look at the numbers for certain rematch models right now for Biden. If I have my numbers correct, I think it's that he only wins against Trump by 1.5%. And again, if I have my numbers correct, in 2020, he won the popular vote by 4.5%. I think it's a lot closer than some memory sometimes serves, especially as we have Biden in the White House right now. And I think another thing that President Biden will be up against is the economy. We've got massive inflation right now, and a lot of economists are predicting that there's this potential depression looming, and whether or not that happens again remains to be seen, but I think he's got some heavy headwinds here to deal with.
All right, speaking of political veterans, Turkey's president, who's a sprightly 69, also drawing attention to his health this week. A stomach bug forcing Recep Tayyip Erdogan to miss a third straight day of campaigning this Friday. And when he did appear Thursday by video link alongside his Russian counterpart for the inauguration of Turkey's first nuclear power plant, well, the country's leader of 20 years did not exactly look his best, Robert Parsons.
He didn't. Well, he's in a tough fight as well. And I don't know whether this will have much influence unless it turns out to be a more serious illness than people have been saying at this stage. But the election is on May the 14th. At the moment, it's neck and neck, about 45%, with most of the survey polling surveys suggesting that the alliance led by Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is just ahead, and that they'll go to a second round. That'll be a real test. If it goes to a second round, it's going to be very tough for Erdogan. You know, things have not been going his way in terms of, we're just talking about the economy in the United States. The economy is not in good shape in Turkey either, with inflation very, very high, and a lot of criticism of the methods being used to deal with inflation in Turkey. So given that, plus the problems that have arisen over the earthquake in the east of the country a month or so ago, and criticisms of corruption, some of them associated with the follow-up to that earthquake as well, over the quality of the housing in southeastern Turkey. You know, he's really in a fight here. The problem really for the opposition is that it's a six-way coalition, and they don't normally get on very well with each other, and that's been showing during the campaign. They're not all pulling in the same direction. Kılıçdaroğlu is not a dynamic campaigner, although just recently he put out a video which went viral in Turkey. That's just him sitting in his kitchen, effectively at home, talking straight to the Turkish people. Surprisingly, it went down really well. So perhaps, perhaps he's finding a way to connect with the Turkish people, which will make things even more difficult for Erdogan.
Kılıçdaroğlu is even older than Erdogan.
74.
So another old white guy, but it would probably be very good news for Western country if it was him, because he can make a new start. And
he got some good news this Friday with the Kurdish-rooted HDP party formally endorsing him.
And he assumed that he belongs to the religious minority of Alevite, and he has Kurdish support. And he's so much calmer and seems to be more modest. So I think for Europeans, it would be good news if there was a new start in Turkey after Erdogan, who is now throwing money. He raised the minimum wages. He raised the
as he always does.
I mean, that's his way of campaigning. But as you said, the earthquake makes it even more difficult for him to win, because not only the mismanagement after the earthquake, but also his responsibility in accepting all these laxist construction sites and not checking about the standards. So all this will hit him now.
Yeah, and he's been softening. He comes from the party, Ataturk's party, and he's been softening. Which is this resolutely secular party, and he's been softening this secular stance of that party to move it a bit closer to the mainstream of the Turkish electorate, which is more socially conservative, and which is kind of Erdogan's base. And in doing that, he's making the party a more viable political challenger to Erdogan's almost 2 decades long rule, and it's really a race now.
Erdogan, though, still has all the levers of power. He's still got a lot of popularity in many parts, and he got what sounds almost like an official endorsement during that Thursday ceremony from his Russian counterpart.
You, President Erdogan, know how to set ambitious goals and confidently move towards their implementation. The ceremony also shows that the leadership of the Republic of Turkey and the president personally pays great attention to expanding Russian-Turkish relations in all areas.
Shannon Vavra, was that an endorsement?
You know, I think we've seen obviously a very back and forth relationship between Turkey and Russia, so it's definitely something to watch. And if I can just add too, I think one of the things that this health moment that Erdogan had during the live television appearance reminds me and has me watching now is, of course, the disinformation front. Some speculation had circulated on social media about what his ailment was. There were some apparently false allegations that he'd had a heart attack coming from some Chinese state media. And the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said, you know, we're not trying to meddle in other countries' elections, but it's definitely a reminder that the space is ripe for potential disinformation, muddying of the playing field and influence. So it's something to definitely watch over the next couple of weeks as this election plays out.
Yeah, rumors about leaders' health. There are a dime a dozen. First round slated for May 14th. There have already, by the way, started casting ballots. 3.4 million Turkish citizens abroad. Nearly half of them, Ulrike Kolterman, are in Germany. And it's interesting because last time around, the Turks of Germany voted for Erdogan, a lot of them. Same as here in France, by the way.
They do it. At the same time, they're happy not to be there. So it's a bit ambiguous.
Erdogan had wanted to campaign in Germany as well.
Absolutely. But there's also the problem that Germany is very reluctant to give them citizenship. So it's always a very complex situation. And there are definitely some Turks who are very pro-Erdogan in Germany, but I think they're not representative of the Turkish community in Germany.
All right, well, Turkey's next president will continue to have war on his doorstep across the Black Sea as Russia haggles over a grain export deal with Ukraine. It's targeted cities across the country before dawn, including with cruise missiles fired presumably from the Caspian Sea. At least 24 killed to the latest count in the central city of Uman. The attacks come as both sides brace for big counter-offensives. And it's kind of a guessing game, Rob Parsons, over everybody's been talking up this counter-offensive for so long. We're wondering, when is it starting?
Yeah, well, they've been talking about it for a long time, but there has been no suggestion that it was going to come much earlier than now. The betting, really serious betting, has been on May, probably late May, early June, because that's in Ukraine is when the ground starts to get a bit harder. Up until early May, it's pretty wet because the spring is a very wet one in Ukraine, and the roads are very difficult to negotiate. And with heavy armor going across fields which are soggy, it's not what you want. It's going to make life really difficult for anybody's counteroffensive, whether it's a Ukrainian one or an offensive by the Russians. So it looks at this stage, or just the defense minister of Ukraine, Reznikov, speaking just yesterday, was saying that they've got all the pieces in place now. They're just waiting, he says, for the right moment to launch the counteroffensive. We'll see, but my bet will be that it doesn't happen till the end of this month, or next month rather.
Shannon Vavra?
Yeah, I think one thing that we could also keep in mind here is that Alexei Reznikov, as my colleague just mentioned, was speaking the other day about this counteroffensive, and he said, you know, the conversation about it may have been a little bit overheated in terms of expectations, because obviously everybody on Ukrainian side and in sort of the Western world wants to have a victory. Something I'm curious about and watching for is, will Ukraine take advantage of some strategic surprise opportunities, for instance, targeting in Kharkiv like they've done before to sort of catch the Russians off guard? Or will they focus more on the southwest sort of regions to sort of try to cut off that Russian land bridge through Crimea, which has been a really central supply and logistics route for Russia? Both, I think, would make a lot of sense for Ukraine, but I'll be very curious to see where they go. And
is there the sense,
too,
let me ask you, Shannon, is there the sense that it's this time or never? Because we've talked a lot about the Russian losses, but can the Ukrainians go through another year of this?
I think it's a really good question. And I think what we should keep in mind is probably that it's not the end-all be-all for the war. We've heard U.S. officials talk about this war likely going into 2024, expectations that it's going to be a protracted war. And I think we've heard that from Ukrainian officials as well, who say, don't expect one big counteroffensive and then it'll be a hoopla and it'll be over. It's more a series of multiple counteroffensives. And I think we've seen that play out a little bit over the last several months, right? From the beginning of the war in 2022, where the conversation for Ukraine was, can we kick Russia out of the territory it's gaining in 2022? And the conversation has shifted to, can we kick Russia out of territory they took in 2014, out of Crimea as well? So I think we're going to see continual pushes. But again, we'll have to see how it plays out.
All right, that 2014, of course, including Crimea, which brings us to another topic. You've heard of reverse psychology. Whoever thought wolf warrior diplomacy would further the cause of peace and dialogue? Meet, if you will, China's ambassador to France, Liu Shai, renowned for his outspoken pronouncements on Taiwan, COVID, and more. The blog in French on the embassy's website, which is suspected to be of his own doing, often incendiary. Last Friday, during a grilling on cable television news channel LCI here in France, he went so far as to question not only Ukraine's claim to Crimea, but the legitimacy of the 14 independent nations that spun off from Russia when the Soviet Union's collapse. These ex-Soviet countries, they don't have actual status in international law because there is no international agreement to confirm their status as a sovereign country. Ambassadors got called in, clarifications were issued in Beijing, and then on Wednesday, Xi Jinping did what his Ukrainian counterpart had been hoping for a long time. Chinese television reporting on the president picking up the phone and calling Volodymyr Zelensky for the first time since Russia's all-out invasion began in February of 2022. Matthew Dalton, can we thank Liu Shai for that phone call?
Possibly. We don't really know exactly why he called, but I think it's a reasonable assumption that this was to try and to calm tensions, not just with Ukraine, but with Europe generally speaking. And I think it's worth remembering that China at one point was really wooing Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe, very strongly. They were trying to invest heavily in Eastern Europe, all across that part of the continent, buying all kinds of infrastructure and buying factories, building roads. This was really a strategic objective of the Chinese government. That has sort of fallen by the wayside. They've pulled back a lot, but the idea that that China really wants to pull Europe onto its side in this sort of strategic conflict that it has right now with the United States. And we saw, Macron being wined and dined when he went to Beijing, and the red carpet was literally rolled out for him. And we saw what he said in terms of appearing to question European commitment to defending Taiwan. And so all of these things, this is a big push by Beijing to try and bring Europe onto its side.
But we were promised this phone call at the time when Xi Jinping went to Moscow, and it didn't come, or at least it didn't come yet.
Right. So I don't think you can assume necessarily that it was sparked because of what Liu Shai said, but I think that the timing is certainly suggestive, and also I think that that Europe is certainly they don't want to have a conflict with China, and so they were happy to get this call.
I think it was also a little bit Macron who was, it was one of the very few political results when Macron went to China, that they said, okay, they're going to call at the
when the moment's
appropriate moment. So it was there. It was coming anyway. And when Lou was playing the agent provocateur, then it was probably the best time. And I mean, he's known for these provocative things. When in the middle of COVID, he said that the French were leaving their old people dying in their care homes. And I mean, he's known to create scandals once in a while. And the foreign minister, Chinese foreign ministry, was very quick to disavow and say that it's not the public opinion, it's not the public position of China. So but I think it was more Macron pushing for this than actually the ambassador.
Robert Parsons, did Liu Shai just go rogue? Or did he blurt out openly what China thinks, for instance, on whether Crimea belongs to Ukraine or Russia?
My feeling is he went rogue. But I mean, he's got a remit to say lots of aggressive, provocative things. And normally speaking, he's in line with Communist Party thinking about where China is going. This time, I think, he, for whatever reason, allowed himself to get out of sync with the Communist Party leadership, and Xi, obviously, in particular, in Beijing. I mean, it's interesting what he said on just another point as well. You said just now that the 14 republics separated away from the Soviet Union. They didn't separate from Russia, rather. They didn't separate from Russia. They separated from the Soviet Union, as did Russia. So what Ambassador Liu said about these countries, including Ukraine, obviously, applies equally to Russia, which also emerged as a separate republic from the breakup of the Soviet Union.
And that's got to make not just the Baltic states nervous, but also places like Kazakhstan. Some of these former Soviet republics don't even have borders with Russia, but instead with China.
Which is why I think the Chinese rode back so quickly.
Right. So it's they don't have designs on, say, Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan.
No, they do have designs in a sense that they want to move into areas that up until now have been regarded as the traditional territory, the near abroad, as the Russians call it, of Moscow. China wants to push Russia out of the Central Asia.
Shannon Vavra, you agree?
One thing I think we need to remember, too, about China, just in terms of timing of this phone call with Zelensky and territorial ambition, is that at the outset of the Ukraine war, just days before China had this conversation with Russia about the so-called no-limits partnership, and then Russia invades, and then U.S. intelligence officials inform everybody that Xi Jinping, according to their intelligence, was actually caught off guard by that. And so I think we see this balancing act from Xi Jinping and from China about territorial ambition, particularly as we consider what China is going to do about Taiwan or not do about Taiwan. And so I think we see this balancing act from China here. And I think as far as the reaction in Europe goes, we've seen many foreign ministers come out and say, this is exactly why we don't think China should be trying to broker a peace here in Ukraine. But we see that these relationships continuing to mold even to this day.
And what irked Shannon, the Ukrainians, was the Chinese named a diplomat who would be in charge of brokering, but it wasn't somebody from their Europe bureau, it was somebody from their Eurasia bureau.
Yes, I believe it was someone who's a former, and correct me if I'm wrong, a former ambassador to Russia, which is a very interesting choice. And I think, and I'm curious what the rest of the panel thinks today on this, the conversation that Zelensky had about their phone call afterwards was, we need to lean on China here and take advantage of the leverage they have and the power they have. And I'm curious where everyone thinks that relationship is going to.
Ulrike Koltermann, China was Ukraine's #1 trading partner before the fighting began in February 2021.
Yeah, and I think there are several leaders who think that if there's one country who has an influence on Russia, then it's China. And Macron was pushing for it, and the Germans are also pushing China into that direction. They don't really want them to be the mediator, but still use its influence. But on the same hand, they are very skeptical that it will happen, because China will always keep its close ties to Russia, and they try to be neutral, and they're not using any influence. I mean,
will always keep its close ties to Russia. You just heard Robert Parsons say they're close, but they're also happy to sap Russia's power.
Yes, but they're still dependent, and they still need their energy, and they still need them as a trade partner. So I think they will not meddle. And what the only thing that when Scholz went and they were asking and trying and pushing them into the direction to be more active in Ukraine, and the only thing what they said is, so please don't use nuclear weapons, and that was so. Nothing really that came out, but they're not going to do more than that, I think.
Yeah, I think China is very happy to buy discounted Russian oil.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's been Russia, along with India, China's become the big buyer of Russian oil since the war in Ukraine began, and obviously that gives China a lot of leverage over Russia, but that may not be a situation that really they're inclined to change, and also given the fact that China, just like Russia, is in a big fight with the United States. And so it's not just Europe that's in play here. It's the United States. They're both countries' relationship with the United States.
And they're competing in Africa as well. I mean, both are very, very active and investing. And Russia has a Wagner mercenaries in several countries. China is for years investing. So there's also another playing field where they're competing.
You mentioned the German Chancellor. He's a social democrat. I don't know if you've seen Ulrike Kohlerman, but the Western press has been gushing ever since her visit to Beijing. The German foreign minister, she's a green because of her straight talk when it comes to Beijing. What is Germany's policy?
The thing is, we have a coalition, and so sometimes there are several parts of this coalition that are not really talking the same language.
Robert Parsons, right now, the role of China, since Macron's trip, picking up on the point made earlier by Ulrike, the role of China in Ukraine, how is it evolving?
Well, look, the Chinese are trying to position themselves so that they can play perhaps a similar role to the one they played in the relationship, the talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They see themselves as one of the major powers in the world now, that they want to be in a position to take a key leading role, as the United States has always done up until now, in settling these sort of disputes. And that's why the Chinese are presenting themselves now as neutral, although many people in the West would not regard them as neutral at all. That's why they keep repeating this. We are neutral. We're not going to pour fire, alcohol, whatever the expression was, petrol onto the fire.
But they're using Russia's talking points when they described. They exactly. Called it the readout of the phone call between Zelensky and Xi called it the crisis in Ukraine. Didn't mention Russia's invasion.
Exactly. Nobody's very convinced at this stage, and the 12-point plan that they put forward was regarded by the Ukrainians and by supporters of Ukraine as a complete non-starter.
They weren't even consulted.
Yeah, they weren't even consulted. Yeah. But it's important for the Ukrainians to keep the Chinese on side. They recognize that if anybody can influence Moscow, it is Beijing. And it's very important for them.
And just one final point on that, Shannon Vavra, because the National Security Council spokesperson at the White House after that phone call called it, quote, a good thing. Explain, with the enmity these days between Beijing and Washington, can you explain a little?
I think when we look at the relationship between U.S. and China, one thing to remember, too, is that U.S. officials, when they talk about China's relationship to a potential conflict with Taiwan, they say conflict is not inevitable. And so I think seeing this conversation where China's interested in potentially brokering peace or a ceasefire, or I think what they're calling a political settlement, might look like good news to Washington. And I think it's also important we remember when it comes to the Chinese perspective, historically, it's all about winning wars without actually fighting them. And so I wonder if it's this focus on increased diplomacy that might be a good sign.
But still, I don't think that brokering is their main interest. I think the main interest is always economical interest, and they're probably already looking at the phase of the reconstruction of Ukraine, and they need parts in that, and that's why they are trying to start to get a bit more involved.
Washington, the U.S. wants the war to be over, and I think they realize that the only country out there that can really, to some extent, force Russia to the table is China, because without China's support, They're not going to have a huge buyer for their oil. They're going to lose access to a lot of manufactured goods that they need, particularly for their military right now with all the sanctions that the West had placed. So I don't think Russia is really in a viable position without Chinese support. And so to the extent that China can force Russia to the negotiating tables to some extent, that's probably what Washington understands at this point.
And that will be the final note for now on this. Of course, we'll continue to follow. Matthew Dalton, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Ulrike Kohlerman, Robert Parsons, Shannon Vavra in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.